Should we even be doing cold therapy or cold plunges as women? Let's chat about it. Welcome back to Wellness Fixes the Pod. I'm your host, Dr. Kelsey Vick, a board-certified orthopedic doctor of physical therapy and a pelvic floor physical therapist. And I figured at the beginning of the new year, it would be fun to chat about some more biohacky things in sauna, cold plunge, things like red light, all of the adjuncts that we can add to our health and wellness routines. I am going to preface this. I never want to be a biohacky podcast. I wholeheartedly believe that if you do not have the foundations of sleep, exercise, fueling, stress management, and good quality relationships, that these little extras like red light, like sauna, like cold plunge won't necessarily move the needle in the way that you want it to. If you have the foundations down, these little extras, these sprinkles on the top might be beneficial, but they are not going to be near as effective in most of your health and wellness goals compared to just mastering the basics. But I know you guys are probably interested in them. I'm interested in them. I think there's new research and science coming out all of the time on a lot of these things just because they are so trendy right now. And I figured what better time to dive in than in the new year when a lot of people are probably wondering, should I add a new device or invest in my health and wellness in this way? Is it going to help me towards whatever goals I have for the new year? So today's episode, we're going to chat about why women's bodies respond completely differently to cold than men's bodies do, the one temperature that actually works best for women and why it's not necessarily as cold as you can go, how our menstrual cycles and general hormonal physiology actually changes our cold tolerance, the truth about cold exposure and things like recovery, inflammation, our metabolism, our ability to burn fat. And at the end, we will chat about a practical protocol for those of you guys who want to incorporate cold exposure therapy or cold plunges into your health and wellness routine. So the mainstream narrative that I've heard is this: the colder you can go, as long as you build up to it, the better. The more adaptations that happen, the better it is for your body. Popular protocols revolve around 39 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius for max metabolic benefits. And that might be the case for some, but not necessarily for women. For men, that broad statement really is more effective for the male physiology and the way that men handle cold exposure. When males are exposed to extreme cold, their sympathetic nervous system is activated, and that cold is sensed as a stress. So that sympathetic nervous system is that fight or flight nervous system. It is sensing that cold as a stress. Norepinephrine is released, brown fat is activated, which creates a stronger thermogenic response where glucose and fatty acids are actually utilized as fuel to produce heat, which creates long-term metabolic gains. And that is how the male physiology responds to cold. Brown fat's job is to generate heat, not to store energy. So through cold exposure, men have a higher uptick of brown fat activation for help with that heat generation. Thermogenesis is the process through which our body actually creates heat. So it basically helps to convert calories and use those as energy to create heat. And in men, all of this is a very positive thing. So cold activation of brown fat in men is associated with increased glucose uptake and insulin sensitivity, higher acute energy expenditure during cold exposure, and improved lipid or fat clearance from the bloodstream. So this mainstream view of cold exposure actually really works for men, except if their foundations aren't solid, if they are in a period of extremely high stress where adding even more stress onto that might tip them over the edge a little bit more. And they shouldn't use it after strength training, which all of these exceptions for when cold exposure might not work for men are also consistent with what doesn't work for women. If we are in a high stress environment or a high stress time in our life, cold exposure might tip us over the edge. If we use it after strength training, it might blunt some of the gains and the rebuilding that we want after that strength training. And if we don't already have those pre-existing solid foundations, again, cold exposure will not benefit us in the way that we want it to. So to contrast that, what happens to women's bodies when presented with extreme cold exposure? If you guys think back to our episode on fasting and the guest experts that we've had on that have mentioned why fasting is different for women compared to men, they mention this term of energy availability. and our bodies as women are extra sensitive to low energy availability. So when we sense low fuel sources for whatever we're about to do, our body kicks into this survival mode a little bit quicker. So think of that concept and apply it to cold exposure therapy, and that is exactly what happens within our bodies as women. Women's bodies sense that fight or flight and start to mobilize resources even quicker, meaning the stress response tips from good stress to bad stress and dangerous stress really quickly. Our body's threshold for sensing that stress is a lot lower than men's. So that good stress turns really quickly to bad stress, especially with extreme cold exposure. So our fight or flight activates more quickly and way more intensely. Our adrenaline and norepinephrine rise, our heart rate and blood pressure increase, breathing becomes more rapid and shallow, and we vasoconstrict, so our blood vessels decrease in diameter and circumference faster and more intensely. Metabolically, we produce less cold-induced thermogenesis than men. Glucose is mobilized quickly to help maintain core temperature. So rather than utilizing it, our bodies sense that we need that for survival to maintain that core temperature. So we mobilize that glucose a little quicker. Fat oxidation might increase, but not as reliably as in men, because as women, remember that fasting episode, we hold on to that fat in order to store it up for survival, for reproduction. That's why when we fast, if we do fasted exercise, our body doesn't immediately mobilize the resources we want it to mobilize, like fat. It might utilize things like muscle in order to help fuel whatever we are about to do, because we need to hold on to that fat for certain processes within our body. The same thing can be said about cold exposure in women. So overall, the cold might increase the energy demand, meaning it's placing a stress on our body that our bodies are going to have to respond to. But our bodies as women are more sensitive to energy mismatch. So if we don't have enough fuel, or our body is not sensing enough fuel, our bodies will start to conserve whatever it can and get rid of non-essential processes, something like reproduction and our reproductive hormones that help to regulate our cycles will become affected. So hormonally, our bodies will prioritize survival over reproduction. So cortisol will increase because we are sensing that stress. Our thyroid hormonal signaling slows down in order to conserve energy. With chronic extreme cold exposure, estrogen and progesterone communication might slow down, which can lead to cycle irregularities. Our core temperature is also influenced by the different phases of our cycles. So we are most likely going to be less tolerant to cold in our luteal phases, our high progesterone phases, compared to our follicular phase, where we might feel that cold is a little bit more approachable. The same thing happens with menopause, where we might feel a little bit less tolerant to cold during menopause because of those hormonal shifts. So the bottom line when it comes to cold exposure for women specifically, in extreme colds, women's bodies conserve heat aggressively, elevate our stress hormones, and reduce non-essential outputs, sometimes opting for survival over less essential processes like reproduction, which again is very hormonally driven, so our hormones will be affected. So this all sounds really great. Like, why would someone even do it? There are, of course, benefits, but the benefits to that extreme cold exposure are not the same in men versus women. Women benefit from cold exposure at a lot higher temperatures of cold. So rather than that 4 degrees Celsius, that 39 degrees Fahrenheit, we might need to do cold exposure at more that mid 50 degree Fahrenheit to 60 degree Fahrenheit range, or around that like 14 to 15 degrees Celsius mark. So if we do it at these moderately cold temperatures, we might find benefits within our bodies with decreased inflammation. Cold still does help with inflammation. Our bodies might induce mild shivering thermogenesis that can trigger some brown fat activation, but again, not to the extent that a man's body will. We might experience menstrual cycle symptom relief, stress training in small doses. I have heard, I'm not recommending this, I have heard that some pregnant women expose themselves to cold in order to prep for labor and delivery and physically challenging tasks that their body's about to have to go through, as a way to help them build resilience. I have not looked into that at all, but I do know that some women do that. And then lastly, we might experience improved mood through release of catecholamines like norepinephrine and dopamine. So if you like cold exposure therapy, if you've been doing it for a while, how can you optimize the protocol you're currently doing? And if you'd like to add it for some of these benefits, here's a protocol from someone that I trust in this field, Dr. Stacy Sims, who has done a lot of research on heat therapy specifically, but a lot of research on female physiology and how a woman's body handles things differently than men. So for general health and metabolic resilience, the temperature should be about 14 to 15 degrees Celsius, which is about 57 to 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Duration of 2 to 5 minutes, 3 to 4 times a week, morning or post sauna, so something like a contrast therapy situation, but avoid right after strength training. As I said, men and women who do cold therapy right after strength training won't receive the benefits from that strength training as much as they would if they didn't do the cold therapy after. With this protocol, you get a little bit of a mood boost, a little bit of a focus boost, mild shivering thermogenesis for that mild metabolic boost. And you do all of this without tipping into that bad stress side of the equation. If you have menstrual symptoms, it's recommended to not get into a cold plunge. Do more local cold, whether that's an ice pack or some form of localized cooling, not full body plunges. And this helps to just modulate certain pains and symptoms that are associated with your menstrual cycle. So, what is it about strength training? Why should we not do it after strength training? With exercise specifically, what's happening is you are breaking down those muscle tissues. With skeletal muscle strengthening specifically, you're breaking down those muscle tissues. That then signals the subsequent repairing and rebuilding of those skeletal muscle tissues and the bone underneath. So, with cold exposure therapy, that communication is altered, it's hindered. There's not as efficient of signaling between that muscle breakdown, that acute inflammation that happens with that breakdown, to cue the subsequent rebuilding and the signaling of all of the chemicals and modulators and proteins that need to be activated in order to rebuild that muscle stronger. So, cold basically dampens that communication, which can dampen the results that you want to get from that strength training session. So let's work through a few of the mistakes and debunk some of the myths when it comes to cold exposure therapy for women specifically. Mistake number one we've mentioned is chasing the coldest temperature. If 0 degrees Celsius works for someone like Andrew Huberman, then it's got to work for me, right? When in reality, you're not actually maximizing your adaptations as a female, you are triggering that chronic stress. Our bodies switch to that bad stress with cold exposure therapy a lot quicker than Andrew Huberman's body does as a male. So that is mistake number one. Instead, stick to that mid 50s to low 60s range Fahrenheit or that 14 to 16 degrees Celsius range for moderately cooled temperatures for cold exposure therapy for our bodies as women. Mistake number two is ignoring your menstrual cycle. Our cold tolerance changes throughout our cycle. So if we are doing extremely cold therapy in our luteal phase, our body is going to sense that need for survival even quicker. So possibly taking out cold therapy in your luteal phase, or if you are going through menopause or perimenopause because of those hormonal shifts, might actually benefit your body better than pushing through. If you do want to do cold exposure therapy throughout your cycle, maybe modifying the temperature a little bit in your luteal phase compared to your follicular phase, because in that follicular phase, your body will be able to handle that cold a little bit better. You can also just skip it in your luteal phase. It's okay to only do it in one phase of your cycle. It's actually great that you are able to listen to your body and know what's happening physiologically to know when your body's able to tolerate cold throughout your cycle. Mistake number three, cold plunging after every strength session. I get it. It's like habit stacking, but again, we are really affecting the cues that muscle breakdown is supposed to be giving to the rest of our body. So reserve cold exposure therapy for recovery or heavy training blocks, not necessarily daily post-workout. Mistake number four, doing cold exposure therapy when you're already stressed, especially chronically stressed. And this works for both men and for women. If our bodies are already in a high stress state, what good is putting another stressor on top of it? There are some things that work that way in the body, but cold exposure therapy seems to be one of those where both a man's body and a female's body are going to respond more negatively with that stress of cold on top of an already stressed environment. So if you're sleep deprived or under chronic stress, cold exposure therapy might not be for you right now. I also had the pleasure of talking to a doctor of traditional Chinese medicine back in the spring, Dr. Felice Chan, and she mentions her views on cold therapy and heat therapy, saunas, and cold plunges from more of an Eastern medicine perspective. And I loved that. So I want to include that clip here just to give her perspective on it, since we did get the chance to ask her opinion from a perspective I'm not as familiar with.
So again, there's the feminine, the masculine, and women are more feminine energetically as well. And meaning that we are more yin. Men are more yang. Yang again is hot, yin is cold. So when you put cold and cold, it puts you further off balance, right? It makes you even colder. Hence why a lot of research now is showing that women do need more warmth. And even just the way that our body metabolizes and deals with homeostasis, we don't need as cold. From a Chinese medicine perspective, I would say if you're in your period, do not cold plunge. It's going to make your period worse because we need a warm uterus, we need warm womb, and physically putting our body in cold is going to stagnate everything and cause more issues. However, not to say women can't cold plunge. And from like my perspective, and I know it's a specific perspective, to start hot and hot. So contrast therapy is something that I do recommend, but not just a cold plunge for women because it can be too shocking to their body, which then spikes their cortisol, affects their hormones, creates more issues in the long run.
So, to end on a few red flags to cold exposure, if you start experiencing menstrual irregularities, persistent fatigue, even though you're getting good sleep, an elevated resting heart rate, or things like fatigue, hair loss, or increasing cold intolerance, of course, all of those are reasons to stop cold exposure therapy. This is something we have to be a little bit more cautious with as women, just because our bodies really do have this fine balance between what's good for us and what's not so good for us. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Take a listen to our sauna heat therapy episode just to compare the two and learn something about our bodies as women from the perspective of heat and cold acting as adjuncts into our wellness routine. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned a lot. I am so excited. Our podcast festival is just around the corner. So stay tuned for all of our fun episodes that we'll be releasing with different experts on different goals that we all have within the new year and ways that we can approach those goals in a science backed way, understanding the education and science behind them. So I am very excited for that in the next few weeks. As always, my goal is to share the knowledge and education that our experts are going to give us over the next few weeks with as many people as possible. So if you would be so kind to share the episode with someone you think would enjoy it, rate, comment, review on whatever platform you listen on. We are on YouTube if you prefer to watch. Not that it's very interesting, I'm just talking right now, but I know I've become more of a podcast watcher. So if you prefer that form of listening or watching to your podcast, we do have that option. I would really greatly appreciate any sort of sharing, commenting, supporting through subscribing or following the podcast on whatever platform you're listening on, reviewing it on whatever platform as well. That really helps. Thank you guys so much. And I'll see you guys again on the next episode of Wellness Fixes the Pod.